Violet Ashby was 14 years old when her mother first tried to drown her. It happened in the winter of 1883 in a wooden tub behind their tenement in Philadelphia. Violet's spine had begun to curve that year, twisting her body into what the doctors called a serpent's shape. Her mother, a devout Presbyterian, saw something else entirely: the mark of Satan slowly coiling through her daughter's flesh. "I was saving your soul," her mother would later tell the police after neighbors pulled Violet from the ice-cold water, blue-lipped and gasping, "Better dead and in heaven than alive and crooked." Violet was placed in an asylum for wayward girls. She spent 2 years there, sleeping on a wooden board meant to straighten her spine, enduring the stares of the other inmates who crossed themselves when she passed. The matrons called her the Twisted One. The other girls called her worse. Then, on a humid August evening in 1885, the Metamorphosis Pavilion came to Philadelphia. Violet first saw the poster on the asylum wall. A matron had brought it in, laughing cruelly about "freaks like you, girl." The image showed a chrysalis split open, and inside, instead of a butterfly, was a radiant human figure, perfect and transformed. Below it, words that Violet would never forget: "Come as you are, leave as you were meant to be." That night, Violet Ashby climbed out of a second-story window and disappeared into the summer darkness. She was 16 years old, and she would never be seen by her family again. She wasn't alone. By 1885, Dr. Cornelius Wren had perfected his recruitment method. The Metamorphosis Pavilion didn't advertise in newspapers or on Main Street corners. Instead, Wren's advanced men, themselves transformed members of the circus, would seek out specific locations: asylums, poorhouses, hospitals for the incurable, charity wards where the disfigured were hidden away from polite society. They would leave posters in places where only the desperate would see them. They would whisper to the nurses and attendants about a place where the different were celebrated, not punished, where twisted spines and missing limbs and facial deformities were not marks of shame, but signs of divine selection. When Violet arrived at the circus grounds on the outskirts of Philadelphia, she found she was not the first to answer the call. There were others, perhaps 24, standing nervously at the entrance to a massive red tent that seemed to pulse in the lamplight. There was a boy, no more than 12, whose face was covered in numerous growths that made him look like he was wearing a mask of melted wax. His name was Thomas Weir, and his father had sold him to a traveling medicine show when he was 8. The show's proprietor had kept him in a cage, billing him as the Toad Boy. When the medicine show disbanded, Thomas had been living on the streets of Pittsburgh, stealing food, sleeping in alleys, chased by gangs of children who threw stones and called him Monster. There was a woman named Abigail Cress, born with arms that ended at the elbows, smooth stumps where her forearms should have been. She was 32 years old and had spent the last decade in a Catholic charity home, where the nuns told her that her disability was penance for her mother's sins. She had tried to hang herself twice. The scars on her neck, made by rope, were still visible. There was a man called simply Red because of the port wine stain that covered the entire left side of his body, from scalp to foot, making him look as though he'd been dipped in blood. He'd been a dock worker until the other men refused to work alongside the Devil's Marked One. He'd been unemployed for 3 years, drinking away what little money he begged on the streets. And there were more. A girl with a cleft palate so severe she could barely speak, twin brothers one with dwarfism so extreme he stood barely 3 feet tall, the other with gigantism that had stretched him to nearly 7 feet, both of them displayed in carnival sideshows since childhood. A woman whose face had been destroyed by smallpox, leaving her features barely recognizable as human. A young man born without eyes, just smooth skin where his eye sockets should have been. All of them outcasts, all of them broken by a world that saw their bodies as aberrations, all of them standing in the darkness, waiting to be told they were something more than monsters. Dr. Cornelius Wren emerged from the red tent at midnight. Contemporary accounts describe Wren as both repulsive and magnetic. His own facial deformity, a condition that medical historians now believe was severe Treacher-Collins syndrome, had left his face collapsed inward, his jaw recessed, his eyes bulging. When he spoke, his words seemed to come from some interior cavity, echoing strangely. But there was something in his voice that made people listen. "You have been lied to," he told the assembled group that night. "You have been told you are cursed. You have been told you are punishment for sin. You have been told you are broken." Violet would later write about this moment in a diary that was discovered in 1891, hidden in the walls of an abandoned barn in Ohio. Her handwriting, barely legible, described how Wren's words felt like they were unlocking something inside her chest. "You are not broken," Wren continued. "You are unfinished. God has begun a great work in you, and the world in its ignorance has rejected you before the masterpiece is complete. But I see what you are becoming. I see the divine architecture in your bones." He walked among them, touching each person, his twisted fingers tracing their deformities with something like reverence. "You were chosen," he said. "Before you were born, you were marked for transformation. Your pain is sacred. Your difference is holy. And here, in this place, we will complete what God has started." Thomas Weir, the 12-year-old covered in tumors, began to weep. Abigail Cress fell to her knees. Red stood perfectly still, tears cutting tracks through his stained face. Violet felt something she had not felt in years: hope. "Join us," Wren said, "not as freaks, not as monsters, not as entertainment for those who would gawk at God's work. Join us as initiates in the great mystery of transformation. Join us, and I will show you what you are meant to become." One by one, they entered the red tent. None of them realized they would never leave. The interior of the red tent was unlike anything the new arrivals expected. Instead of the cramped, filthy conditions they'd known in asylums and charity homes, they found something closer to a monastery. The space was divided into small, clean cells, arranged in concentric circles. Each initiate was given their own space with a cot, a trunk for belongings, and a mirror. That mirror was important, Wren explained. They would need it to watch their transformation. For the first week, life in the circus was almost paradise for these abandoned souls. They were fed 3 meals a day. Real food, not the slop they'd grown accustomed to. They were given clean clothes. They were taught to read and write if they were illiterate, given books about anatomy and theology if they were educated. Most importantly, they were treated with dignity. The other performers, those who had been with the circus longer, welcomed the new arrivals as siblings. They shared stories of their own arrivals, their own transformations. A woman named Patience, who had been with Wren for 5 years, showed Violet her arms, They were covered in raised scars, arranged in perfect geometric patterns, spiraling from shoulder to wrist. "This is the sacred mathematics," Patience explained, her voice dreamy. "Dr. Wren is teaching my flesh to speak the language of angels." When Violet asked if it hurt, Patience smiled. "Pain is how we know God is listening." Thomas Weir was taken under the wing of a man called Brother Michael, whose own face bore the marks of extensive surgical modification. Michael's nose had been removed entirely, leaving only 2 holes in the center of his face. His ears had been cropped close to his skull. When he turned his head, you could see that his neck bore deep grooves, as if someone had tried to carve it into segments. "I was a drunk," Michael told Thomas, "a worthless drunk who slept in gutters. Dr. Wren found me dying in an alley in Baltimore. He showed me that my body was a lie I was living. He helped me cut away the false parts. Now I'm becoming what I was always meant to be." "What is that?" Thomas asked. Michael's lipless mouth stretched into what might have been a smile. "I don't know yet. The transformation isn't finished." Every evening, Wren gathered all the circus members, performers and initiates, in the center of the red tent for what he called lessons in flesh. These were part sermon, part anatomy lecture, and part testimonial. Wren taught that the human body was God's unfinished sculpture. Most people, he explained, were born relatively complete. They were the rough drafts, the simple forms that required little divine intervention. But some souls were special. Some souls required extensive revision. These were the chosen ones, marked from birth with physical differences that signaled God's active work. "Why does a baby come into the world with a twisted spine?" Wren would ask. "Why are some born without limbs or with faces that make others turn away? The priests say it is punishment. The doctors say it is accident. But I tell you the truth, it is selection." He paced as he spoke, his deformed shadow dancing on the tent walls. "God is sculpting you. Every moment of pain you have endured, every stare of disgust, every word of hatred, these are the chisel strikes. The world sees monstrosity. I see the divine artist at work. And here, in this sacred space, we will work with God to complete what He has begun." The initiates listened, hungry for meaning in their suffering. Wren explained that transformation required submission. The body resisted change instinctively, clinging to its current form. To truly metamorphose, one had to surrender completely, not just mentally, but physically. One had to invite the pain, welcome the blade, embrace the breaking of bones and the cutting of flesh. "This is not mutilation," he insisted. "This is cooperation with the divine plan." Violet wrote in her diary, "For the first time in my life, someone has told me my pain means something, that I am not being punished, but prepared. I would do anything to be finished. I would endure anything to finally be complete." The actual procedures began after 2 weeks of indoctrination. Wren started small, minor modifications that he framed as alignments. For Violet, this meant the surgical straightening of one finger that had grown crooked. For Thomas, it meant the removal of a small tumor from behind his ear. For Red, it meant the tattooing of symbols into his port wine stain, marks that Wren said would sanctify the discoloration. These first procedures were performed in a central operating theater, a raised platform where all the circus members could watch. This public nature was essential to Wren's theology. Transformation was not private. It was communal worship. Everyone participated. whether as subject or witness. The procedures were done without anesthetic. Wren explained that pain medication would dull the divine communication. God spoke through suffering. To block the pain was to silence God's voice. Violet screamed when Wren broke her finger to reset it. She screamed until her throat was raw. But around her, the other circus members were singing hymns, their voices rising to drown out her agony. And Patience held her free hand, whispering, "God is speaking to you. Listen. Listen to what he's saying." When it was over, when Violet lay gasping and sobbing on the operating table, Wren cleaned the blood from his hands and smiled his twisted smile. "Good," he said. "Very good. The first word of your transformation has been spoken." In the days that followed, Violet was treated like a hero. The other performers congratulated her, told her how brave she'd been, how beautiful her pain had been to witness. They examined her reset finger with reverence as if it were a holy relic. And slowly, terribly, Violet began to believe them. The procedures grew more invasive over the following months. Wren worked on each initiate systematically, performing operations every few weeks. He removed toes, claiming they were unnecessary appendages that weighted the soul. He broke and reset ribs to align the sacred geometry of the thorax. He tattooed entire bodies with symbols he claimed to have seen in visions, mathematical formulas that described the divine blueprint. Abigail Kress, the woman born without forearms, volunteered to have her arm stumps surgically extended through a process of systematic bone breaking and stretching. Wren broke the bones, inserted wooden spacers, and let them heal before breaking them again. The process took 6 months and left Abigail with arms that reached several inches farther than before, but which were now twisted masses of scar tissue and barely functional bone. She wept with joy when she could finally reach far enough to feed herself. Thomas Weir's tumors were not removed but consecrated. Wren cut into each growth, inserted small metal pins, and sewed them back up. He explained that the pins were creating a sacred circuitry that would allow Thomas to commune more directly with the divine. The boy ran constant fevers, but he never complained. He was becoming something special, he told the others. He could feel God rewiring him from the inside. Red volunteered to have his entire port wine stain tattooed over with black ink, transforming it into what Wren called the shadow map of his true form. The tattooing took 3 months, done in sessions that lasted hours, the needles driving ink deep into his discolored skin. By the end, Red's entire left side was solid black, marked with spiraling patterns that Wren claimed showed the path his soul would take toward completion. Not every procedure was voluntary, though few would admit this later. There was a young woman named Hannah who had joined the circus with a cleft palate. After her first surgery, a realignment that left her unable to speak clearly, she expressed doubts. She told Violet privately that she wanted to leave, that she thought Wren was lying to them, that this wasn't divine transformation but torture. Hannah disappeared 3 days later. When Violet asked where she'd gone, Patience smiled serenely. She completed her transformation. She was taken up. Taken up where? To the next stage, beyond the flesh. Hannah was so advanced that she transcended the need for a body entirely. We should all be so blessed. But Violet noticed that Hannah's belongings remained in her cell, untouched, and late at night, she thought she heard screaming from somewhere beneath the tent, muffled and distant. She never asked about Hannah again. While the transformations continued in the red tent, the Metamorphosis Pavilion still functioned as a circus. They needed money for supplies, for food, for the medical tools Wren used in his procedures. So they performed. But these were not typical circus performances. The initiates who had undergone Wren's procedures became the main attractions. They were displayed not as freaks to be mocked, but as living religious icons, evidence of God's active work in the world. Violet, with her increasingly twisted spine and now modified hands, 3 fingers removed on the left hand to create divine asymmetry, performed as the serpent saint. She would contort her body in ways that her original deformity never allowed, the pain of her surgically altered skeleton creating new, impossible shapes. She moved like something inhuman, her spine bending at wrong angles, her remaining fingers clawing at the air. Audiences watched in horrified fascination. Thomas performed as the Constellation Child. In the dark, the metal pins in his tumors caught the light, glinting like stars across his disfigured face. Wren had him stand perfectly still, while his brothers and sisters pointed out the divine geometry of his affliction, drawing lines between the pins to show sacred patterns. Children in the audience had nightmares for weeks afterward. Red became the living shadow. His tattooed body shone under special lights that made the patterns seem to move and shift. He would speak in tongues, glossolalia, that Wren claimed was the language of angels, though it sounded to most like the ravings of fever. After each performance, Wren would give a sermon. He would explain the theology of metamorphosis, invite the marked ones in the audience to come forward, to join the sacred work. And always, there were a few who answered the call. The circus grew. More outcasts arrived. More procedures were performed. More transformations began. And slowly, those who had been with Wren longest began to change in ways that couldn't be explained by surgery alone. By 1887, some of the earliest members of the circus had been undergoing Wren's procedures for 5 years or more, and witnesses, both circus members and paying audience members, began reporting things that defied medical explanation. Patience, the woman with geometric scars, claimed she could feel her bones shifting beneath her skin without surgery. She said she would wake in the night and sense her skeleton rearranging itself, following the patterns Wren had cut into her flesh. Other circus members confirmed that her proportions seemed to change week by week. Her arms appeared longer 1 month, her torso shortened the next. Brother Michael, the man who had mentored Thomas, had undergone so many procedures that he barely resembled a human being anymore. His face was a flat plane of scar tissue. His body had been segmented by deep cuts that Wren had made and allowed to heal as grooves, making Michael look like he was assembled from pieces when he moved. His joints bent at angles that shouldn't have been possible. Some witnesses claimed Michael could dislocate every bone in his body at will, could fold himself into shapes the size of a small trunk. Whether this was truth or showmanship was impossible to determine. The most disturbing transformations happened to those who had been with Wren from the very beginning. The original 4 who had helped him establish the circus in 1875. These 4 were kept separate from the other performers, housed in a section of the red tent that was curtained off. Violet only saw them during the most important ceremonies. They no longer looked entirely human. Their bodies had been so extensively modified, broken and reset so many times, tattooed so completely with Wren's symbols, that they moved like animated sculptures rather than people. Wren called them the Ascended Ones, beings who had completed most of their metamorphosis and were approaching their final divine forms. When asked what those final forms would be, Wren would only smile his twisted smile and say, "You'll see. When the transformation is complete, you'll all see." Despite the horror of the procedures, most of the circus members remained devoted to Wren. This confused outsiders who occasionally investigated complaints or disappearances. How could people willingly submit to mutilation? How could they watch others being cut apart and call it worship? But for those inside the red tent, the logic was inescapable. These were people who had spent their entire lives being told they were worthless, disgusting, cursed by God Himself. They had been abandoned by families, locked away in institutions, displayed as monsters, driven to the edge of suicide. They had internalized the message that their bodies were wrong, sinful, worthy only of shame. And then Wren told them something different. He said their bodies were sacred. He said their pain had meaning. He said they were chosen. The physical agony of his procedures was nothing compared to the psychological agony they'd already endured. At least in the red tent, the pain had a purpose. At least here, they were told they were becoming something beautiful. Violet wrote in her diary, in an entry dated September 1887, "My mother tried to drown me because she thought I was demon-touched. The asylum tortured me to straighten my spine. The outside world saw only a twisted girl, useful for nothing but pity or mockery. Here, Dr. Wren sees a masterpiece in progress. Here, my body is not a prison, but a canvas. If I must endure pain to be finished, then I will endure. I will endure anything to finally be complete, to finally be loved." This was the terrible genius of the Metamorphosis Pavilion. Wren had taken society's most vulnerable people, those already broken by trauma and rejection, and offered them the one thing they desperately craved, significance. And for that, they would let him do anything. In August 1887, the circus arrived in Ashwood, Pennsylvania. It was meant to be a routine stop, 3 weeks of performances before moving on. But something went wrong. Later, investigations would piece together a fragmentary story. Local minister Reverend Thomas Blackwood had organized opposition to the circus, calling it godless and corrupting. He'd pressured town officials to revoke their permit. He'd stood outside the circus grounds, warning people away. Wren saw this as an opportunity for recruitment of a different kind. According to testimony from survivors, Wren began targeting not just the physically different, but the faithful. He sent performers into town to spread a new message, that the Reverend was fighting against God's will, that those who opposed the circus were opposing divine transformation itself. Several church members, devout Christians who believed they were defending their faith, came to the circus grounds to confront Wren directly. The Reverend himself came with witnesses. They entered the red tent. What happened inside was never fully documented, but the survivors, those who were not church members but existing circus initiates, described a ceremony unlike any they'd seen before Wren performed what he called forceful transformation on the minister and his followers. Not gradual modification over months, but immediate, brutal surgery meant to break their will and prove his divine authority. The screaming lasted for hours. When it was done, 17 people had vanished. Some were dead, their bodies later found buried in geometrical patterns outside town. Others had been transformed so extensively they were unrecognizable. and a few, according to whispered accounts, had been changed in ways that shouldn't have been possible. Ways that suggested Wren had discovered something beyond surgical technique, something in the relationship between faith and flesh and pain that allowed for transformations no scalpel could achieve. Reverend Blackwood's wife, Martha, escaped. She was found 3 days later, her hair white, clutching a piece of the red tent. She would only say, "They're still changing." The circus disappeared that night, and with it went Violet Ashby, Thomas Weir, Abigail Cress, Red, and dozens of others, all the lost souls who had believed Wren's promise of completion. None were ever seen again. In the decades that followed, there were occasional reports. A traveling show in Kentucky in 1889 featured performers who matched descriptions of former Metamorphosis Pavilion members, but they used different names and claimed no memory of their past lives. A woman resembling Patience was spotted in Missouri in 1892, performing contortions in a medicine show, her body covered in those geometric scars. She told people she'd been born with the scars, that they appeared spontaneously when she was a child. Thomas Weir's family received a letter in 1894, postmarked from Montana. It contained only a single sentence in a child's handwriting. "The transformation is almost complete." Violet Ashby's diary was discovered in 1891, hidden in an abandoned barn in Ohio. The final entry, dated 3 days before the Ashwood incident, read, "Dr. Wren says I am ready for the final procedure. He says my spine has been prepared through years of sacred work, and now he will complete what God started. He will break every vertebra and reset them in the true divine geometry. He says when I wake up, if I wake up, I will no longer be human. I will be what I was always meant to become, a perfect expression of God's will, freed from the lie of my original form. I am terrified. I am ecstatic. Tomorrow, I will be reborn." The diary ended there. What happened to the lost souls of the Metamorphosis Pavilion? Were they victims of a madman's delusion, mutilated beyond recognition, or killed in botched surgeries? Or did they truly transform into something else, something that allowed them to disappear from history entirely? The rationalist answer is clear. They were vulnerable people exploited by a charismatic cult leader who used their trauma and desperate need for meaning to commit acts of systematic torture. They died or lived in hiding, too damaged to return to society, too ashamed of what had been done to them. But there are details that don't fit this explanation. The bodies found outside Ashwood showed modifications that 1880s surgical techniques couldn't achieve. Witnesses consistently reported seeing physical impossibilities during performances. And there are those persistent rumors of a traveling show that still surfaces in remote areas, featuring performers who look like they've been extensively modified, who speak of transformation and completion, who bear the mark of the split chrysalis. In 2003, a folklorist researching disappeared circuses received an anonymous package. Inside was a photograph, undated but clearly old, showing a group of people standing before a red tent. Their faces had been scratched out of the image, but their bodies were visible and wrong. Spines that curved in impossible spirals, limbs that bent at too many joints, proportions that suggested extensive skeletal modification or something worse. On the back of the photograph, in spidery handwriting, someone had written, "We are not finished yet." Were the members of the Metamorphosis Pavilion victims? Absolutely. They were exploited, mutilated, destroyed by a man who used their suffering as a tool of control. But they were also believers. They submitted willingly, even eagerly, to transformations that would horrify any reasonable person. They saw beauty in their mutilation. They found meaning in their pain. And in the end, that might be the most disturbing truth of all, that people who have been broken badly enough, who have been rejected completely enough, will embrace even horror if it promises them belonging. Somewhere, perhaps, the transformed ones still exist, changed beyond recognition, beyond humanity itself, but finally, terribly complete, and still believing they are beautiful,